If you grew up around the church, you probably have a specific image of how getting into heaven works. You arrive at the pearly gates, and an angel checks a massive, glowing ledger to see if your name is on the list. We treat the Book of Life like an exclusive VIP guest list. In this modern assumption, God sits at a desk with a blank book, waiting. The prevailing thought is that your page stays empty until you say the right sinner's prayer, or tally up enough good deeds. Only then does God finally pick up the pen and write your name down. Living with this mindset creates a chronic state of performance anxiety. Your faith becomes a stressful exercise in making sure you didn't miss the list, constantly wondering if you've done enough to earn your spot. This VIP list metaphor projects a modern bureaucratic concept backward onto an ancient Near East text. It shifts the entire meaning of God's original intent. Reading ancient scriptures through modern lenses leads to spiritual conclusions the original authors never intended. To find the actual meaning, we need to compare our modern assumptions directly against the civic laws that governed the first century Greco-Roman world. This matrix shows the contrast. On one side, we have our modern assumption, where entry is earned, producing constant anxiety. On the other side, we have the ancient historical reality, where entry is based on birth. We will evaluate these two frameworks to see which one aligns with the Book of Revelation. To understand what the original authors meant, we have to look at how a first-century citizen living under the Roman Empire thought about citizenship. Every major ancient city kept a civic registry. This was a physical, legally binding ledger maintained by the city magistrates to track who belonged to the city. This flowchart maps out the actual Greco-Roman civic law process. Notice the starting point. When a citizen was born, their name went straight into the ledger. You weren't added to the book because you proved your worth. Your name was recorded because you had life, which instantly granted you the rights and protections of the city. The only time a magistrate opened that book again was to remove someone. If a citizen died naturally or committed high treason, the magistrate took a damp sponge and wiped the wet ink right off the parchment. In the ancient mind, citizenship was a default state. You were born with it, and you only lost it through a definitive rupture, like treason or physical death. Apply this ancient civic framework to the Old Testament, specifically the aftermath of the Israelites committing idolatry with the golden calf. Moses pleads with God to forgive the people, and he says, "If you will not forgive their sin, please blot me out of your book that you have written." Moses doesn't ask God to write him into the book. He assumes he is already in it, without ever having asked to be added. God's response confirms the ancient civic rule. He says, "Whoever has sinned against me, I will blot out of my book." Because God is the author of life, every human is born into the register, and only rebellion triggers an erasure. The tragedy of sin isn't failing to earn a spot in a blank book. The tragedy is committing spiritual treason that forces the author of life to erase you from a book that was already full. In the New Testament era, the context shifts to the early Christian churches scattered across Asia Minor. When the Apostle John writes Revelation, he makes a deliberate change to the phrasing. He upgrades the concept from the Book of the Living to the Lamb's Book of Life. The Greek word he uses for life here is zoe. This describes an eternal, indestructible resurrection life, distinctly different from temporary natural life. The flaw of an earthly civic register is that natural life always ends in natural death. Eventually, everyone on an earthly ledger gets erased. Entering the Lamb's Book is a transfer of citizenship. To survive eternally, your identity can no longer be tied to your natural birth. It must be secured by this spiritual rebirth. This brings us to Revelation 3:5, where Jesus says he will never blot out the name of the one who conquers. As 21st century Westerners, we often read this backwards. We view it as a threat, picturing Jesus holding an eraser, ready to wipe us out the moment our performance slips. But the actual audience for this letter were first century Christians, facing real civic erasure and execution by the Roman Empire, just for practicing their faith. For them, Jesus' words meant he held the ultimate register and refused to use the sponge, regardless of what the earthly empire did to them. When viewed through this ancient context, Revelation 3:5 describes eternal security at the exact moment the world cancels a person. If you struggle with performance anxiety in your faith, You can trade that fear for the assurance that God's default posture toward you is inclusion. And if you value historical rigor, looking at the ancient civic context restores the text's original authority and meaning. You have to choose whether you will rely on a temporary earthly citizenship that ends in erasure, or accept the indestructible life offered by the Lamb. Aligning our modern reading with ancient historical reality replaces performance-based anxiety with the security God described to the early church.